Welcome to another episode of Frontlines on Intune Training with Jake and Johannes with a special guest, Sean Bulger. Sean, you want to give us a little introduction?
Yeah, hi. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sean Bulger. I am a consulting engineer at a large Microsoft partner. I also run a blog site, managed.modernendpoint.com, where I write about basically all things modern endpoint management. Currently, I'm working on a series around REST APIs and automation using Microsoft Graph, the admin service, and all that other fun stuff.
Awesome. Now, Sean, obviously, being a consultant, you see a lot of environments, so you're not used to just sitting in the one, every day to day. Everybody's going to be a little bit different. But do you want to kind of give us an idea of maybe like the different business verticals that you've dealt with, endpoint count as an example, user count, all that fun stuff, or the environments that you've actively working in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked personally in companies that I've worked with. Like I said, I've worked at a large accounting firm, which was around 3,500 seats. I worked for a large produce company, which was only probably a few hundred seats, but that's a lot of people growing peppers. I worked for another large public health organization that was around 3,500 seats. As far as companies I've consulted in, I've worked with large education clients. I've worked with professional sports franchise. I've worked with financial institutions. I've worked with a lot of smaller mom and pop shops as well. So it's really been everything from, I would say my smallest client is probably around 75 seats, up to my largest right now is probably around 25,000.
So you've definitely
Wow.
seen just about every kind of environment for the most part that you can probably think of.
I have seen things that I never really expected that I would see, and the neat thing is I've been able to jump into different parts of the technology that I never had a use case for.
Awesome.
So, with those clients, what have they been like? Have they all been like you've been in the business for a long time? So, have most of them been relying on like config manager, group policy, or have they gone into the MDM space?
It really has been a mix. So if I look at the companies specifically that I worked with or worked for directly, probably the single most mature organization that I've ever worked with from a technical perspective was actually the accounting firm. We had, I want to say our IT team was around 75 total people. We had a large SharePoint team. We had thousands of different SharePoint sites. We had an endpoint team that had 3 or 4 people on it. And so that was probably the largest and most mature organization I've worked at. That's really where I got my start. I actually was given the project to migrate all of our mobile device management, specifically at that point in time was just iOS and Android, over to Intune. That was back in the very early days of the Silverlight portal.
Oh,
It was
I remember that. It was so bad.
it was especially bad. It wasn't, I mean, it wasn't terrible, but from an end user perspective, we were able to, I think it took us about 6 weeks to get up over 2,000 enrolled mobile devices,
That's pretty quick.
which at that point, I think that we were actually one of the highest device counts that Microsoft had in a customer. So it was actually kind of a neat experience. But that was probably the most mature organization. As far as the companies I'm working with now, I really see see the whole range. So I've got a lot of companies that don't have configuration manager at all. They're just managing devices with group policy and bubblegum. And then I've got a lot of customers that are that have configuration manager in place. Some have already taken the step to deploy Intune. A lot of the time, they're just coming out and saying, "Hey, we want some help with understanding how we should be deploying this or how we want to use autopilot." So I've seen people at all different steps in the journey. It really ranges what people want to do. Most of the projects I do are probably EMS pilots, so that's initially just an Intune endpoint manager. Basic pilot migration, hey, we're going to get some devices up here. We're going to hybrid join some of your existing devices. We're going to do a quick pilot of autopilot. I've got a number of people that are doing configuration manager to the cloud management gateway. And then with that, also piloting autopilot, usually at that point in Intune. But most of the customers I work for are probably more in that exploratory phase of saying, hey, this has been out here long enough. It's not going away. It's a stable product. How can we really leverage that? And a lot of that is coming directly out of the pandemic of saying, hey,
Yeah.
everything we've been doing has worked, but now it's not really working the best. So what can we do next?
Awesome. Well, I know you mentioned a few things earlier, but as far as like those previous solutions, I mean, were there really a lot of like challenges that made them want to make the change? I mean, obviously the pandemic. You mentioned earlier SharePoint sites. I know back in the day those were not fun to manage. I always think or harken back to the old Groove client, and I have nightmares. But you also mentioned like holding everything together with a group policy and bubblegum. But I mean, other than that, was there any other kind of like challenges that they might have encountered that makes them want to change?
I mean, I've seen, again, a lot of challenges. So going back to the accounting firm and that first Intune migration I ever did, we were using a product called Good Mobile. In my experience, Good was a really bad name for that product. So
decent mobile or just horrible mobile?
Worked when it wanted
Could have
to.
Been better mobile.
Yeah. So I think the big challenge that we saw with that one is it had this concept called flow control, which is as bad as you can imagine it would be. So essentially, if it detected you were on a slow network, it said, "Hey, I'm going to kind of slow down the traffic here. I don't want to slow down the entire device, so I'm just going to slow down." Which really, with email, shouldn't be that big of a deal. The problem was, it didn't always detect when it was no longer on a slow network. So, when I say it would slow down to like bytes per second. So it would take a day to get an email. And so this product, and there were 2 or 3 people at the accounting firm who called the help desk probably almost weekly because they would go up to their cabin up north or something, and every time they would do that, their device would get flow controlled, and the only way to fix it was to fully re-enroll it. So part of what we were looking for in a solution is we wanted something that was essentially going to be zero touch from IT. It was all BYO, so everything was personally owned devices. The requirement there is they did have to fully enroll the device. They didn't want to use MAM policies. In fact, at the start of that project, the MAM policies and MAM apps weren't even fully deployed. So we had to have something that was going to be easy for end users to understand. So we looked at a lot of the different options, and we came around to Intune because people were used to that Microsoft sign-in flow. And we said, hey, this is pretty easy for end users to understand. Let's go ahead and deploy this. We wrote instructions that in the end look an awful lot like Microsoft's instruction, very step-by-step walking people through it, really not knowing how this process was going to go. And as soon as we put it out there and basically said, this is what you have to do, we doubled our user count that we had on the previous solution. The number of support calls for mobile device management dropped. I forget the numbers exactly. There used to be a Microsoft story about what we did, but I want to say the estimate was that we saved the company around $2.5 million in support costs when you factored in not just the support time staff, but the billable hours of the accountants who were calling in, because we were getting multiple calls a day. So if you put
It's
a dollar
not a small
amount
figure,
yeah, and if you put on a consulting accountant's billing rate and you say that you're not billing 10 hours a day, I mean, that's a lot of time that you're
absolutely,
so it was a very sizable savings. So that was probably the biggest challenge that I've seen from that perspective. When I look at a lot of my customers, probably the biggest one that I keep hearing from people is updates. How are we going to make sure our devices are updated? How do we make sure that our users who are remote are getting that content down to their machines? The other big thing is just around deployment as a whole. I've got a lot of customers who've been using SCCM. It works. It does what they need it to. They've got very robust task sequences, but they're realizing that, especially for their remote users, they don't need to manage as much stuff on the device, but they need to efficiently provision a device basically and get it out in that end user's hands. And that's where a lot of them are starting to explore autopilot. That's when autopilot came out, that was kind of the promise, that we were going to have this product that we could
zero touch.
Zero touch. Somebody could go get a computer off the shelf at Best Buy, sign into it, and be good to go. And so customers are starting to explore that. I still don't know that it's completely there where everyone wants it, But especially for some of our smaller customers and people who have fewer technical requirements, they're not running, Autodesk or something like that. That's a really large product. It really works great for your standard end user who just needs Office and who just needs a few basic applications.
So moving on. So with both the companies that you worked for and now the clients that you are working with, how do you have anything to say on like the company politics that tend to get in the way, and how have you managed to handle them?
So politics are always a sticky thing. I mean, there's a lot of different things. When I look at companies I worked for, the accounting firm was fairly easy because we were looking primarily at mobile devices, and it was something that people had a product that really wasn't working for them. So it was easy to say, here's a different product that works a lot easier, and it's usable by or serviceable by the end users. That was a fairly easy sell. Our challenging sell there was because we were requiring them to enroll a personally owned device, it was how do we sell that? And for that, we found a way to essentially pitch that as a positive of, hey, we can now wipe your device if you lose it. We can lock it remotely. We can do different things. And so users didn't have a lot of issue there. Probably the most common thing that I've seen, again, in other companies I worked for, and then with customers is, well, yeah, we want to do this, but we can't touch the CEO's device. We can't touch that person's device. And we all know that that's not a good thing. I mean, that is the first device you need to secure. And so a lot of it is, yeah, make it work, but just don't inconvenience the decision makers and the money makers, which I get it. If you're in IT, you don't want to push back against those people. But at the same time, those people who are signing your paychecks are the people who are at risk. Mm-hmm. So if we're really doing our jobs right, we should be able to convey, hey, you know what? Your device is the one that everyone's after. Nobody cares about, they might care about my device because, I've got administrative rights, but I'm not a high value target. I don't have all of the company secrets. I'm not somebody who can convince somebody in finance to send me a $130,000 check or anything, So that's one of the biggest political things that I've faced is how do we apply those policies? One of my favorite ones was our support manager at one company turned around. We started applying MAM policies, and we said very specifically, hey, you know what? We don't want people to be able to cut, copy, and paste outside of our policy managed apps into unmanaged apps. The support manager really said, no, that's not a good thing. The CIO and the infrastructure director said, nope, we need to do that. Turn on that policy. So we turned on that policy, and about 2 weeks later, the support director was sitting on his phone in front of me. It's like, I can't copy anything out of Excel. Why can't I copy things out of Excel? I'm like, oh, you know that policy you said you didn't want. Well, somebody else said they wanted it, so we turned it on. And so those are a lot of the political battles I face. The other thing that I see, which I saw when I was in corporate IT, but I see a lot as a consultant, and this is something that I think applies to a lot of us as IT people as a whole, we can be very territorial. So when you bring in a consultant or you turn around, I was the young guy pitching the new solution that the older guys didn't want to use. Young is the relative term there. Young in my career. Trying to convince them to move to this cloud-based solution. So at the accounting firm, I ran the mobile device platform there for about 2 years, and that's where I also learned Config Manager and everything. Intune wasn't really ready. Microsoft Endpoint Manager, sorry. I like to harp on getting product names right. I should do that. Microsoft Endpoint Manager wasn't ready. Well, at that point, it was Intune. It wasn't ready for PC management, and it could kind of do stuff, but it couldn't do it well. So we never really went down that path. We never really explored that. Now, as I've kind of moved on, that one company I was working with or working at specifically, there I stood up Configuration Manager from the ground up, stood up Intune. They were using a product called Matrix 42 for managing endpoints. It is a very, from what I can tell, a very painful product both to manage and for end users. And there were a lot of politics there with the people who had been running that, saying, "Well, no, this is what we use. This is what we've always used." They knew it was the right move to move away from it, but it was a little bit of that. We don't want to give up that piece of control. We don't want somebody else to be running this endpoint because that's our baby. And I see that a lot, and I see that with a lot of customers that I work with too, is where people say, "Hey, I get that there's this Intune thing out here, but we've got Configuration Manager, and it works, and it's always worked. So why would we do anything different?" So there are a lot of different political battles there, from just those little, "Hey, how do you convince somebody to let us manage their device?" to overcoming those internal obstacles. And I think that's something that I've spent a lot of time in my career working on, is saying, how do I move beyond some of these obstacles? And I think one of the things that we as IT people can be a lot better at is trying ourselves not to be that obstacle. And when something new comes out, listening and saying, "Hey, what can I do better?" And so
kind of develop that understanding, because we're always like, "Hey, I've got the best idea," but be open to any kind of change that's out there.
Exactly. So sorry, I keep rambling away from your question. So maybe
no, you're hitting them right on the mark. This is great.
Yeah,
we love this stuff. So, but let's move on to the next one then.
Yeah.
So obviously, different clients, everyone's got a different size. They've all got different expectations. But like on average, if you're helping anyone migrate over to Intune, different things like that, do you have like a set time frame that you normally see, or like how many dedicated resources it takes, like people wise, to get that project up and going? Or I'm sure it's going to vary.
So this is a really interesting question, especially right now. And this is, I like to talk about like kind of the underlying theory about a lot of things sometimes. And there's a really interesting paradigm shift going on right now. So when I was in corporate IT, I worked with a lot of consultants, and it was like, you fly that consultant in, that consultant's on site. They're on site for a week, they're on site for 2 weeks. You're dedicating all of your resources to that team, and you're sitting in a room, you're working hard until you get things to a point where it's ready to be piloted. So I think back to the accounting firm, the first Windows 10 pilot we did, we had people from Dell on site, we had people from Microsoft on site. And we dedicated our entire team, so 3 people, 3 endpoint administrators basically, to this Windows 10 project, along with 3 or 4 outside people for 2 weeks. And we got to the point where that was literally on 15.11. We got to the point where we said, Windows 10 is not ready for enterprise yet. It wasn't ready for us. And so we spent 2 weeks to basically, and a lot of man hours, to find out that it wasn't the right solution. That's definitely atypical, especially now. I think that the big shift we're seeing, as I'm saying that we're seeing this shift, is, before with a consultant, you would want to bring them on site. They had to be there physically in the building. Well, now, as everyone started working differently, I think a lot of companies have realized, hey, I don't need that consultant in the building for a few reasons. One, I'm dedicating my time to that consultant. If they're on site, I've got at least one person sitting with them the whole time working on this project. Maybe I can complete it in a shorter amount of time on the calendar, but I can't do anything else during that time frame. So yeah, maybe you could do an entire Windows 10 pilot in 2 weeks, but I've dedicated time to that consultant. I've paid for that consultant's travel. I've done all of this work. And so there's a lot of a shift now where companies are realizing that, hey, if I just work with this consultant for 4 or 6 hours a week, they can spend some time. Most of the work we do now is all over the shoulder. So I'm walking somebody through saying, here's the settings, here's how you package a 132 application, for example, and here's how you build it out, here's how you test it. And then between that call and our next call, they'll test a few themselves, and they'll do a lot of the work. And so we're spending, I don't want to say we're spending fewer hours, but the hours matter more. The way I like to put it is, and I'll say to a lot of my customers, is if I go through an Intune deployment with somebody, or if we're going through autopilot and we complete the project, and then 6 months later I look back in your environment, If you brought me in to do another project and nothing had changed in that 6 months, I would feel like I hadn't have done my job. My job is as much to teach people how to use the products and to feel comfortable. And there's no environment that has no changes over 6 months. So if I come into somebody else's environment, they didn't feel comfortable to make a change in that 6 months, I did something wrong. I didn't train them and get them ready.
Mm-hmm.
So to ultimately answer your original question, I would say if I'm looking at the actual number of hours to get to the point of being able to, pilot, say autopilot, if you've already got a basic understanding, we can probably get to the point where we're piloting and have a decent number of configuration policies and applications in somewhere between 40 and 60 hours, sometimes more, sometimes less. It depends on your environment. But by the end of that project and by the end of that time period, you should be really comfortable in how you run it. Typically we'll be able to run a device through in the first couple meetings, and then by the time we build it out, like I said, probably about that long. So realistically, that project is probably about anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks on average. But as far as actual man hours, it's no longer than it would have been when we were on site. So,
in fact, it seems almost pretty short. I mean, 40 to 60. I can't imagine doing that with Config Manager nowadays.
Certainly a configuration manager project is a lot larger. I mean, I want to say that most of those that I've gotten assigned are anywhere from 120 to 200 hours on average for just and that's for a basic configuration manager rollout. Yeah, that's not
all the basic.
That's not
checked,
assuming anything.
Basic task sequence.
Exactly. So it really depends. I mean, how involved is customer IT? How involved are we? Typically, I find a lot of people are a lot more willing now to jump in and do a lot of the work themselves, which, not that I'm trying to get people to do the work themselves, but I want them to feel comfortable and confident to be able to do that.
So I've noticed in my career, and this is true, I guess, everywhere else, like someone in IT wants to drive a change or implement something, and they can only go so far. But if they're able to get a consultant involved, like, hey, we can just hire this guy, he's an expert. Once the expert shows up and does his spiel, all of a sudden they get a lot of traction. So do you feel that as a consultant, you're in a position to drive policy in your customers' environments? Like, when you show up, you basically have the final say all of a sudden.
So this is something that was really unusual for me, making the shift from corporate IT to consulting. I had spent a lot of time with Intune. I had spent a fair bit of time with Configuration Manager, but really, realistically, at that point, I had 6-7 years of experience, real IT experience. I literally at the start of 2014, I was a paramedic. So I shifted fairly late in my career over to IT. And so this concept of being the expert was really unusual to me. Who was I to be able to go into a customer environment and be considered the expert? That just felt off to me at first.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So, I get taken into my first project and I'm sitting there and I'm like, you just asked me a question, and I know that when I answer this question that you're going to take that as gospel. Like, you're going to assume that is the correct answer. And so that was kind of a culture shock moment for me. It's also something that really helped me in my personal career growth. If you look at my early blog posts, the first 4 or 5 are all about imposter syndrome and, am I good enough? And that was something that really helped me change my way of thinking. And so, it is kind of funny because as the expert, I know, and expert again in quotes, as the consultant, I know that when I say something to my customers, that a lot of times that's going to go up to a CIO, or it's going to go up to an infrastructure director, or it's going to go to somebody who's going to say, yeah, no, that sounds like a really good idea, when literally, and a lot of times they'll say it directly to me. They'll say, no, we're not going to do that. That's not a good option. And then I don't want to say we push back, but there is a certain level of turning around and saying, hey, this is kind of the direction the world's moving, and if you want to build a roadmap that's ready for the future and ready for tomorrow, these are the changes you should make now. I never go in there with the mindset that what I say is the last word. There are no two environments that are identical. I can give recommendations, I can give best practices, and I can really help to try and push things in a certain direction. But I never assume that what I say is definitely what they're going to do. But I do find a lot of times that, obviously they do listen to what the consultant had to say. There was a reason they hired us. But it's really funny to me because I was that guy trying to make the case, being like, oh, the expert said, that guy said, he knows what he's talking about. So it is a little bit of a different shift. So do we drive some of those decisions to a point? I mean, it really is always the customer's decision. But a lot of times it's not even so much about this person's the expert. It's more about person has seen it, and it's an outside third party. So typically, no matter what the question is, there were already two different opinions in the room before I walked in. So it's almost like
you're the unbiased one in a sense.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. It helps to just drive home the point of here is more of the modern principle, and that's what I always try to drive towards. Of not necessarily, I mean, yes, I'm always trying to find the right answer, but I'm trying to find what is the answer that is going to be the most sustainable over the long term.
Absolutely. So our next question is one that's fun. I think Microsoft even struggles with answering it at times. That's licensing. Obviously, you see a lot of different clients. They're probably going to have all sorts of different licensing models. But typically, do you have a recommendation or one that you typically like to go with?
So, I mean, in my experience, and this is one where I've seen, again, both in places that I've worked and customers, I've seen all of the different licensing levels. Obviously, the Cadillac is that E5 license. If you can get that, if you can convince somebody to pay for that, do it every single day. That's the
that
perfect
Defender
world.
for endpoint data pays for itself half the time.
Oh, absolutely. So if you can get there, which I have successfully made that argument a couple of times in companies I worked for, and rather unsuccessfully in one company I worked at. So if you can make the argument, then absolutely go with the E5. When you're looking at the different options, the breaking point is somewhere around 2.5 to 3 a la carte features on top of the previous license levels when E3, you should make the jump. And so if you're at E3 and then you're, we'll pick on Teams. So if you're using Teams for voice calling and everything, if that is your phone solution, at that point, by the time you add on that Teams calling license, or like you mentioned, the Defender for endpoint,
you're already at the cost, if not more.
Yeah. Exactly. So it's at that point, it's worth making that jump. And so what I typically say to customers, because this is a question that I get pretty frequently of, hey, we weren't sure, so we went with E3. So if somebody is already in that position of they've got E3, if they just got the licensing, typically, I mean, and I'm sure you guys have seen it, you're sitting there, you see all of these features that are available to you, and you can't turn them all on right away. You want to. You want to flip every single switch. I had one customer, and it was one of my, he did my dream. He basically got the mandate that they had to secure their environment right now. And so he went in and he goes, well, I'm turning on Azure Identity Protection. And that was the only time I've ever said to a customer, are you sure you want to flip that switch? And he goes, no, I'm going to I'm going to do it. And he went in and turned it on and blocked, I don't know, a couple hundred people pretty quickly. One of them had a C in their title.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. And so I get on the next call and I go, how'd that go? And he goes, I turned it off within hours. I'm like, and so that was probably my favorite example of we all just want to flip that switch and see what happens. He did that. It wasn't like the end of the day, but it was also obviously not the wisest decision. But when you're looking at this whole range of features, it's really hard to just implement everything. And so what I typically will say to people if they already have that E3 license is sit down, look at all of the features that you want to use, come up with a plan on how you're going to deploy that, when you're going to deploy that, and then once you've got everything you want there, then go ahead and make that step up to E5. Or if there's features in there you need right now, then go ahead and make that step. But otherwise, take the time to take advantage of what you have now and then make the jump when you're ready to turn on those features. Because if there's one thing that I can say, in the one company I was working at, we went right ahead, we jumped to E5. That was the right decision for a lot of reasons. But while we did light up a couple of those E5 features, at the same time, there were a whole lot of other things that we knew we needed to do along the path, and we weren't necessarily taking advantage of everything just because of the amount of work there was to do and the amount of manpower, and that was a smaller IT department. Yeah. I want to say our entire infrastructure team there was about 4 or 5 people, and so that's a lot for literally 2 people working inside of the Azure O365 space to handle. So.
Oh, absolutely. I think we should also make it clear that when we're talking about E3 and E5 specifically, we are talking about that M365 E3 variant and E5, not the O365. Don't accidentally buy O365 E3 and E5 because that's just fancy Office. You want all the Intune bits, so you want that M variant. And then obviously government schools, they have their A3, F3, different variants. But for the most part, it's pretty close to the same feature set.
So, yeah, and that's a great point. I like to call that the Microsoft alphabet soup, because I'm pretty sure that's how they came up with the license plans. Is a bowl of SpaghettiOs going.
It was in my son's breakfast that morning. I just looked and
it made sense.
Yeah,
ship it
straight to prod.
So, with your clients and customers and like the environments that you have been managing, especially ones who are looking into autopilot, what sort of have they looked into Azure AD joining their machines, or are they handcuffed to the past with hybrid Azure AD join?
I like the way you said that. So the way I always take this, so most customers start out with we've got to be domain joined. We've got to be able to access file shares. We've got to be able to access that. And so the way I always approach it is, I explain obviously the differences between your Azure join and your hybrid join. But then I talk about the ability, obviously, to access a lot of those on-prem resources from an Azure-only device. And I talk a little bit of how we can get there. And then typically I take the approach of let's go ahead and pilot both. So especially when you're looking at autopilot, I like to test things in phases. So I literally stand up a really basic ESP, really basic deployment profile, and I like to say, hey, let's go ahead and just to make sure everything's working, to make sure things are communicating, let's pilot an Azure-only device. Let's not introduce that Azure or the Intune connector yet. Let's not introduce trying to do that domain join process because we might get something wrong there, and we might think autopilot's failing because of what's going on. So let's not introduce extra variables. So I always start there, and I set up a couple configuration profiles, and then that's when I start to have the conversation around, hello for business, because when you start looking at accessing those on-premise resources, all of your requirements for accessing those on-premise resources are all of your requirements for hello for business. So it's essentially, hey, let's go ahead and set this up. And hey, while we've got this set up, let's just show how we can access some of these on-premise resources. And so it becomes telling a story of how we were able to get to that end result without even starting with that hybrid join process. And in my experience, that's actually been pretty successful. I'm not going to say that everybody's gone to it. Everyone's suddenly seen the light and said, oh, wow, Sean, you're a miracle worker. You're a genius. We're just going to do this. But I have had a couple of customers that turned around and did make that decision to say, you know what, all of our new devices, we are going to go this way. And I am seeing more customers wanting to do that. There are definitely still a few that domain join connection is still a hard requirement. And so obviously we'll set that up and we'll make sure that's working. But that is definitely something that we're able to tell the story and help them to understand why there's that benefit to cloud-only join.
Do you think, just to interject a little, do you think those who want to stick with hybrid Azure AD join or traditional AD join, do you think they're doing it out of technical necessity or because of politics, or they just don't understand? Misunderstanding?
I think it can be a little bit of all of the above. I do have some where there's some hard technical requirements, especially in the places where I've seen that the most commonly would be in manufacturing, where they've got a lot of really old legacy solutions, or education. Again, a lot of education software, and it's getting better, but a lot of education software is still somewhat reliant on that domain join. And school systems don't have the money, they don't have the finances to be able to, even if their solution provider has a cloud-based product or has a product that will work, they don't necessarily have the resources to be able to make that jump. So those are the two where I probably see the most technical challenges. There's definitely a little bit of a political piece there. I actually find it really funny because I think the biggest political challenger that I typically have in most organizations is actually from security teams, which they talk a big game and they say we want to move to zero trust, but we have to be domain joined. And you kind of look at it.
Doesn't work like that, sir.
Those words don't mean what you think they mean. Mm-hmm. And because they think that they've got this requirement, because they've always had this requirement, that it's a lot harder to get them to move off of that. So a lot of times with that, it's more about education. It's about getting them the documentation, showing them what things like zero trust actually mean. And so it's definitely, like I said, a kind of a combination of all three. A little bit of politics, a little bit of technical, and a lot of times it's just that old guy in the corner that has been doing it this way for 30 years, so why do we have to change it today?
I feel you. Now, we obviously talked about, obviously accessing on-prem resources and things like that. But typically, obviously, every customer is going to be different. But do you find most people still wanting to do the on-premise access, or do you see, every once in a while a customer that wants to just shift everything, into the cloud, like move it your shares over into SharePoint or Teams, libraries, all that fun stuff?
So I do see more customers saying they want to shift entirely to cloud. They don't really know how to tell that story yet and how to make that happen. But especially in a lot of the smaller organizations, they're realizing they're not doing that much really on premise. And especially in a lot of smaller companies and a lot of companies that didn't have a lot of file shares before, if they're already using Teams, all of the stuff they were using their file shares for, they're already doing in the background because things were already, there are a lot of companies who do all of their business through email and through maybe one or two file shares. So unless you've got hard application requirements or a lot of physical networking, there's no real need for that. And so I do actually see a lot of people starting to say, hey, no, our goal is no on-premise infrastructure. I have one client that I was working with, or that I'm working with, that came in. The original project was scoped for Configuration Manager and Intune, and they turned around and they said, you know what? If we don't have to do Configuration Manager, our number one goal is nothing on premise. So if you're telling us that we don't need to do that, we're not going to go there. And so they turned around and they obviously went straight to Endpoint Manager and Autopilot, and they couldn't be happier because now they're sitting here saying, no, we don't have that on-premise requirement. And really, our only on-premise requirement before was group policy. So if that's the only reason you're on premise, well, why are you on premise? So I do see a lot of customers that are starting to make that shift. And I think the big driver there, so earlier on, I think there was a big question, several years ago, I think a lot of times CEOs, CFOs said, hey, can we can we save money by not having this physical infrastructure? And a lot of IT departments didn't quite believe in it yet. And now I'm seeing more IT departments who are starting to say, why am I getting up at 2 in the morning on a Saturday to update a server? Why am I doing this? What are we using it for?
File share? Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think they're starting to see the necessity. And it's really interesting just seeing how those drivers have moved over time.
I heard a story a few days ago. It was a guy who I basically asked him a similar question. I asked him a similar question about the cloud adoption, and he said, "Well, a lot of people, they don't see any need to go to the cloud until they need to replace the hardware in their data center.
Yeah.
When you have to buy a $200,000 storage unit thing, all of a sudden, just moving all of this stuff to the cloud becomes really interesting.
It makes sense, right?
Yeah, it just makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big things that a lot of people are realizing. And then the other side of it, not that I'm trying to cost anyone their jobs, but there's a real human cost to maintaining that whole infrastructure. Just physically replacing UPS batteries, there's a physical cost. If you're a large organization, you might have someone who spends 10 hours a week just replacing UPS batteries. I mean, that seems silly to say, but there are a lot of little hidden costs to maintaining that, and I think people are starting to realize that. And it's not even so much about getting rid of people as it is about repurposing them to ways that are better use,
more beneficial to the business.
Exactly. If I can, one of so I get a lot of random crazy thoughts of things I'd like to build. One of the things that I've always toyed with is playing with basically just a chat bot for support that would be able to, that you would be able to train to do a lot of your basic tasks. So basically a chat bot that would do proactive remediations. Mm-hmm. And I worked at one place where they said, this is great. We could use this and we could replace so many support people. And I said, no, you're missing the point. That the point here wouldn't be to replace those people. It would be to begin to teach them to identify these things that could be fixed via that sort of proactive remediation idea, and then train them how to fix it so that they can write that script, so that they can put that, and so they become, instead of just becoming level 1 support, now they're all of a sudden learning a new skill set and they're developing internally.
They're hitting level 2, level 3, yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important things that a lot of companies are missing on, especially right now. This is completely unrelated.
Yeah, it's fine.
Random soapbox. It's 2022, but in the midst of this whole great resignation, a lot of companies are saying we're losing really talented people. They're going elsewhere. Well, why are they going elsewhere? It's because they're not getting developed. And one of the most important things that I think IT organizations can do is develop that talent internally. So one of the biggest things that I point out to my customers is actually that troubleshooting and support blade inside of the endpoint admin center. Being able to go in there and go into that portal and show, with our back controls, give a support tech the access to the Intune portal to be able to bounce back and forth and see the same thing that you're working on is, I think, really valuable. 10 years ago in support, you would have basically a script. You'd walk through and you'd say, hey, here's how it works. Just follow the script, fix the problem, move on. Well, now you can actually give your support people access to the same portals and the same consoles that you're working on. So now when they want to start to learn a little bit more about managing endpoints, it's not, hey, you've got to learn this console. It's, let me just turn on a couple more features so you can begin to learn it. And I think that's one of the most important things we can do. It's huge. And if I were talking to a lot of C-level executives in a company, I'd say, give your support people opportunities to grow. If you want to maintain that talent, obviously pay them correctly, but train them and give them the opportunity to learn. I think probably my biggest pet peeve in a lot of places has been that lack of development internally. So,
well, I think if you look at like the MEM community as a whole too, as far as like learning new things, there's so many opportunities. You look at other fields like networking and like server administration, there aren't a ton of people you can go ask. What, like, sure, find someone online, go talk to them, but like MEM, you've got all these different communities all over the place, user groups, Discord servers, conferences, and everyone just wants to help each other. Being able to learn all this stuff, is a lot easier than some of the other fields out there.
Yeah. Well, and so I think that endpoint management is by far one of the most underappreciated
Yes.
IT roles out there. I mean, people think that, oh, you're just that guy who runs Windows. Well, we are the only ones who deal with a physical piece of infrastructure that is in end users' hands. We have the most unpredictable part of IT that we have to deal with. And now we've got to deal with it across multiple platforms, bring your own device scenarios. We've got to deal with it across, on-premise, remote.
Well, you've also got to worry about all the other stuff too, like networking, security. You touch almost everything in that space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, when the pandemic started, the company I was working for at the time was in the midst of cutting over VPN circuits. Well, to do that, we had to update the VPN client. Well, we didn't anticipate a pandemic happening. So literally the second week everyone was remote, I had to figure out how to upgrade everyone's VPN client pretty much seamlessly. And we didn't have a cloud management gateway yet. We didn't have anything like that. So I had to, across the VPN they were using, update the VPN client they were using. And so
what could
good
go
luck
wrong?
I mean, what could possibly go wrong? And we were able to accomplish it. We worked with the support team to make sure they had some good tools to be able to troubleshoot it and correct it. And we had very few problems, again, across 3,500 devices, very few problems with that. And it was because we took the time to do it right and really understand what could happen in the process. And you tell me what other area of IT where you face those sort of challenges on a fairly regular basis, and it just doesn't happen. No offense to systems teams, no offense to networking teams, but obviously understanding IP address ranges. I'm not going to understand IP addressing just about ever. So I give a lot of credit.
Let's throw IPv6 into the mix, and then it's definitely never.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll never get there. So there's a lot to learn in those other fields, but once you've learned it, it's kind of static. What we work on is literally changing virtually daily.
Yeah.
We are the typical use case for DevOps, in my opinion, and it's kind of funny to me that it is so underutilized in endpoint management.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. So when you look at the tools that you have in endpoint management, what features are you looking forward to, like that you know of or have heard of? Obviously, don't break any NDAs.
Yeah. Probably the biggest thing that I'm looking forward to Microsoft getting right, hint, get this one right, is the actually the remote support tool. And by get it right, I mean don't charge for it.
Mm-hmm. You don't want that extra licensing cost? It's not even E5?
I mean, extra costs on top of E5, great. Yeah. If it's even just part of E5, that's fine. I get it. It is kind of a premium feature. I think that is one that really is important to a lot of organizations, being able to have a good solution for remotely managing devices and remotely providing support to end users. We most of us have found ways around that, and we've found ways to still offer support and remote support. But that's probably the biggest single feature that I look at that I say, man, if they get this right, that really will hit it out of the ballpark. And that will take away a lot of organizations' need for a VPN or another third-party solution. It's one thing that, exactly. It's making it that true single pane of glass, which, obviously that was the big buzzword in about 2015, 2016, single pane of glass. Mm-hmm. Well, it's not a single pane of glass until I can remotely manage those devices. So of all of the different things that are out there, I think that's probably the one that I look forward to the most and say, hey, if you get this right, you
nailed it. Yeah.
That exactly. So, but like I said, it's about getting it right, which is don't charge your end users extra, or you don't charge your support teams extra.
Exactly. So. Well, thanks for your time, Sean. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So
obviously,
thanks
we'll
for
have all
having
your
me
info down below, your blog, everything else you've got. And obviously, if anyone in the comments has any questions for Sean, let us know. We'll definitely pass them along. But with that, we're recording this on Groundhog Day, so happy Groundhog Day.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.